everyone. I'm James Milan, and welcome to this episode of Talk of the Town. I am joined by a local author. You know, we do a lot of things in Talk of the Town, but one of my favorite things is that we do get to talk to folks who have done the hard work of writing books, and then even harder work in some ways of getting them published. Anyway, Kate Woodworth is with us today. She is a longtime Arlingtonian, I believe, or...
Depends on how you define it.
Okay, but well, I'll just say she is a current Arlingtonian, we'll find out more in a sec, who has written the book Little Great Island, which we will be talking about to a good degree. But we're also going to start, as we often do at Talk of the Town, by finding out about Kate herself and her journey to this point. So, with that long introduction, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have you. Glad you reached out again, with the accomplishment of the publication of your novel. And just delighted to be able to talk to you. So let us indeed start, if not at the very beginning, let's go back a ways. I know from talking to you before we started on, the cameras rolling, that this is not your first novel. But there's been quite a long, a good amount of time between the first one and this one. So just talk to us about that a little bit, about writing in your life. And
I grew up in Dedham, actually, and had in 5th grade the experience. I had an amazing teacher there, and I remember him coming around to my desk. I'd written a story, and he said, "This is the way real writers punctuate." And I thought to myself, well, I need to know that because I'm a real writer. So that was...
As a 5th grader?
As a 5th grader. Cool. So I am definitely a lifelong writer. My first novel, which was called Racing into the Dark, came out in 1989 from E.P. Dutton, and there was an option on the film rights. At that time, there were a lot of hardcover books were the first out, so the paperback rights sold, and also the German rights sold. So that was really fun. And then there was a long, long, long dry spell during which I was writing. I was also working as a medical writer in academic medical centers. And I wrote probably 6 or 7 novels. And I had an agent. I sent them out. She couldn't place them. Eventually, we broke up. And I was thrilled. I thought, great, now I can find a new agent and now I'll get famous. That didn't work either. And even with Little Great Island, which I finished quite a while ago, I sent it out to well over 150 agents.
Oh, wow.
And most of them got back to me. A fair number of them loved it, but they passed on it anyway. I was so close to giving up. And I couldn't. Something about this book wouldn't let me give it up.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but that is great to hear. I do want to kind of jump on a couple of things that you said there. One of which is that in the interim between the publication in 1989 of your first book and this one, you wrote, you just said, 6 or 7 other novels.
Yep.
Also got them to the point where you then shopped them with agents. So you finished those novels.
I sure did, yeah.
How, just talk to us a little bit. I mean, I really am I tend to think, as a person who has never written a book and won't, but appreciate, I read a ton and I appreciate all authors, I have to say, because again, to me, it's a tremendous accomplishment simply to finish a book. How do you do that? How do you, just talk to us a little bit about that. How do you write one and then write another one and then write another one and nobody's getting to read them, but you feel still compelled to write? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I can't not write. I mean, I don't know what it's like for other writers, but I think for people like me who really, I feel as though I was born into this. I can't not write. And I think I also was kind of born as a novelist. So I can't not write novels. The first ones after Racing into the Dark came out, I got a lot of feedback that said, well, we want one that was like the other one, only we didn't dare try a first novel from an unknown author. So can you just do that again? And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to be able to do something different. And so I kept kind of experimenting with different things relating to voice. And I think ultimately they just were unsuccessful as novels In some cases, they were unsuccessful as far as the agents were concerned. They didn't feel they could market them. And in some cases, I think they just weren't good novels. But it was a great learning experience.
Well, that's a wonderful attitude to have about all of that, labor expended. But were you satisfied with each of those as you finished them up, or were there ones that you yourself were like, I'm not sure about this, and as you got feedback from others, you were like, oh, okay, I guess that wasn't.
I think in many ways, I was definitely satisfied when I finished and sent them out. And I think in a lot of ways, I was interested in kinds of fiction that weren't popular. So sort of dark satire kinds of things that I thought were funny. Other people some of my other readers thought they were funny. But in publishing world, I think they thought, okay, nobody's going to think this is funny, or nobody's going to get this. You read a certain kind of book, and as a writer, you become influenced by that, and it begins to shape your voice and your sensibilities. And so I think in some respects, all of those books and the rejection process were necessary for me to get to this.
Yeah, and I promise you we are going to get to this, but a couple more questions about that. You mentioned that in all those novels that you were writing, you were experimenting with voice in different ways. And for me, voice is a huge, like for most readers, voice is a huge part of the appeal of a novel in particular. Can you tell us a little bit about what kinds of voices were you experimenting with? And, you said that was all a big learning process in a sense. What can you tell us in that way?
I think I've really thought more about voice and the ways in which I'm different from other people, because of course you have to be at a certain age before you really start to recognize that there's ways in which you're processing the world that are completely inscrutable to other people, never mind not the way they're doing it. So I think partially I grew up with my parents playing opera a fair amount. They did it just to drown out the sounds of the children who they'd already put to bed. But I think that got in my ear. And so I became very attracted to writers who were very conscious of the melody of a sentence and who use their sibilants very precisely. And so in the process of writing Little Great Island, I was very conscious of that. And then I started to recognize that that was something that was important to what I was doing in the book. So in terms of specific writers, Sherwood Anderson was important to me. Definitely Anthony Doerr, with All the Light We Cannot See, and just the way the words look on the page and the use of white space, that was all important to me.
That's interesting because you were talking about voice, and you were talking about the use of sibilants, for instance, both of which make me think, okay, you're thinking about words and sentences and passages being read aloud in a sense, because that's the way that a certain amount of that is going to be able to come out, or be, the rhythms of that are going to be most palpable. But then you're also talking about Anthony Doerr and examples of just how graphically or visually the use of white space versus text, etc. So it's just very interesting to get your take on how do you kind of process that in reading other writers, and from your own experience.
That's interesting to me, because actually I don't think of it as being read aloud. It is being read aloud in my head.
In your head.
So that's part of how I'm processing words in particular, but also sounds.
Right, because novels, in fact, are read now, right? There's no longer any tradition, really, certainly in developed, in Western countries where, novels come in this form, or they come on your Kindle or whatever. And it's all, again, like you said, it's the reading is happening in one's head, or the voicing is happening in one's head in a sense. But it's really cool to hear, again, from the voice of, or from the mouth of someone who a very experienced novel writer such as yourself, just how that works, you know, how, again, the use of sibilants, and we should maybe, you know, make clear for our audience what we're talking about there.
There are all kinds of ways of, you know, for anybody who's studied poetry, you know how to scan a line of poetry, you know alliteration, you know about internal rhymes, and for me, sibilance is the use of sibilants. It's that sound, which is a lovely sound, and to me conveys a real sensory sense, as opposed to, well, actually, in some ways, I can hear words and taste them or feel them. And so I think that's just part of my relationship with language. I mean, in addition to listening to opera when I was a child, my parents read to me, and I think there is no greater gift for a child.
That's, I'm glad to hear you say that, because my wife and I did a lot of that as well, and it seems to have been, you know, a good thing.
Yeah.
For sure. All right, let's definitely talk about Little Great Island. This is, as you said, the result of not just your own growth over time, but your growth as a writer as well. So tell us about, you know, what brought you to this, and just describe the novel for folks, because as I know, but our audience doesn't yet, it's quite a combination of different things you have going here.
So the easy way of describing this novel is it's a story of love and community and climate change on a small island off the coast of Maine. And it is, just from a writer's perspective, it is written with 11 different points of view, including the omniscient or all-knowing point of view. So those from a craft perspective, that's a big step out there. That's not the way most novels are told. That's a lot of voices. It's a lot of voices, and frankly, there were more. So that was part of the process of really trying to figure out what this book was about, because, you know, as I mentioned when we were talking earlier, I was not intending to write a novel, and in fact, I was very specifically trying not to write a novel. I just needed a break. I was very concerned about climate change, and that had been an issue for me ever since seeing An Inconvenient Truth, which I think came out in 2006. And concerned meant I had a lot of anxiety, and I spent a lot of time saying, why isn't anybody doing anything? And then I had that inconvenient truth. I'm not doing anything.
Either.
Oops.
Right.
And at the same time, I had been writing these vignettes and character sketches that all took place on this island off the coast of Maine called North Haven, where I went as a child, where my father had gone as a young man. It's an incredibly special place, and it just absolutely lives in my heart and in my soul. And when I realized I had to do something if I was going to keep complaining, happily, that process only took me a couple of hours. And I thought, I don't think I can undertake that learning curve to write about climate change from the nonfiction perspective. But why don't I take all of these vignettes and my concern and put them together? And it made sense, because the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than almost any other body of water on the planet. So those islands are definitely affected. And then I thought, okay, but what about it? And I thought, let's have there be a disappearing species. Well, a lot of species have disappeared. Nobody gets very upset. And I thought, well, how about a cute fuzzy one? A lot of cute fuzzy species have disappeared. Well, the one that makes sense for Maine is the lobster. Not cute, not fuzzy, but definitely iconic.
And important.
And important.
Yeah.
And that's when I really dug in, and I had to both get up to speed on what's happening in the ocean and to the lobster population. I had to figure out which of these characters could stay in the novel and which ones had to go, and how to make them all work together to create a narrative that, because there are so many switches in point of view, I had to make sure that worked for the reader and created a story and didn't create confusion about where we were.
Yeah, which sounds like an awful lot of complication for you as a writer and challenge.
Yes.
Do you feel like it really, and when you said before that in some ways you needed to do all the other writing you had done in order for this to happen,
Yeah.
is that part of what you're talking about, that you figured out over these many decades of writing now, how to juggle so many different things in a coherent and compelling way?
I think a lot of it was self-confidence. It was just knowing I own my writer's chops, and I can sit there and have people say, you can't write a book with 11 different points of view. You can't use the omniscient. And I'm like, well, actually I can, and I'm going to. And so I think that was the biggest piece of it, really, in terms of how I actually had to put this together, because this really was, it was primal ooze. I had a lot of visualizations. I have a whiteboard. I had a foam core that had the different arcs. There are two main characters who carry the storyline, Mari and Harry, and I had their arcs. And then I also had the third arc, which was kind of everyone else, and figuring out how all of that went together. And in the end, I refer to the process as playing 3D chess in the dark. And I don't play chess. So,
do you usually visualize in the way that you were just talking about? No. So that was particularly helpful, again, because you were what I call juggling so many, just had so many balls in the air here. You needed to kind of make sure you were clear on that yourself, I would think. That's super, it's very, very interesting. I welcome you to make any further comments you want about the book itself and its content, but I also want to talk about the fact that it's not just the book that you're here to discuss and promote, really, but it is a campaign that you're also you're getting going in conjunction with the publication of the book, right?
There is, yes. It's called Be the Butterfly, and it is a grassroots climate action initiative. And what happened here was, when climate fiction really first began to take off, the hope and the assumption was that that empathetic response that readers get in response to fiction would result in climate action. It didn't work. And in fact, there was a study done a couple of years ago that showed that that empathetic response really only lasts a couple of days. At the same time, I was really reading some things about how often creative people are at the forefront of social change. I still think there's some things that need to change. And I thought, okay, how do we as writers leverage that and get at the forefront of change in terms of climate change? And I thought what we need to do is tie the action more specifically to the book. So in the end of the book now, there are a few pages that talk about the Be the Butterfly campaign. One of the first, my publisher said, that's a great idea. Why don't you come up with a dozen nonprofits and we'll list them in the back of the book? And I spent a couple of days on that, and I thought, why is it up to me? So I reached out to a dozen climate writers and explained the Be the Butterfly campaign and asked them to give me the name of a nonprofit that was related to conservation or climate change. And I think the first person I heard back from was Bill McKibben. And I was floored. And I thought, okay, now what? And so I reached out to Peter Heller and some of my personal idols, Lydia Millett. And then I thought, okay, let's talk to some local people. So Julie Carrick-Dalton, who lives in Boston, who is a climate writer, a woman named Kate Woodworth, who is very much interested in social justice around climate change issues. And then I was kind of feeling my oats. So I wrote a note to Barbara Kingsolver's office, and I was hiking in Colorado, and I happened to get cell service, and I saw, yes, Barbara wants to participate this. And I'm out there in the middle of nowhere going, Barbara Kingsolver, Barbara Kingsolver.
That's fantastic. Obviously a moment you are not going to ever forget.
No. And all of these people have been so generous with their time. Bill McKibben is my personal hero. He's out there 24/7 fighting for democracy and for the climate, and yet he still responds to me.
Yeah, and directly, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, that is so heartening, isn't
Yeah.
it? To realize that you can still register with somebody again that we think of as inaccessible in so many ways because the name is so familiar.
Yeah.
That's not the only name that you've got attached to the book, I have to say, because you've had some quite quite praiseworthy quotes that you also kind of let us know about as you were reaching out about the book. But I mean, Ha Jin, for instance, a National Book Award winner,
Yeah.
had lovely things to say about the book. So.
He did. And, you know, just in terms of my background, I did grow up in Dedham. And then in the late 70s, I moved to Salt Lake City. And I lived out there for almost 30 years before moving back here. And many of in fact, I think all of the writers who have given me such beautiful blurbs, I've met since I've been back. And it's really been such a gift to be part of the literary community here. So I'm not sure what names people are familiar with, but Marjan Kamali, who has written a couple of internationally best-selling books, Whitney Scherer, who lives in Arlington, and Whitney wrote an absolutely beautiful book called The Age of Light.
I want to get back to the Be the Butterfly campaign again. What is it that you're looking for people to do, and how can they do that?
What I'm looking for people to do is something. I don't know how many people remember when Michelle Obama said, do something, and I thought, yay. Because I think it's really hard for people to know what to do about climate change. And so whether it's denial or just the busyness of life, I think people set that one aside. And I think there's guilt, too. And so then people are like, well, you're not so good either. It's not about being good. It certainly isn't about being perfect. It's about doing something. So I don't care. I ask people to do something. I think it increases awareness. I think it brings hope. And I hope ultimately, because this is a reference to the Butterfly Act, or sorry, the Butterfly Effect, that all of these small acts will have a large and positive effect.
Yeah, and I imagine that for most people who are tuning in, they're aware of what the butterfly effect is, but I did realize that as we were talking about it, we hadn't really kind of said, oh yeah, this is what this is talking about. So go ahead and let the audience know.
My interpretation, because it is developed by somebody a whole lot smarter than me, really is that one small act, like a butterfly flapping its wings, can have significant repercussions in a complex system. We all live in a complex system. So that's really where it comes from. There is a character in the book, Mr. Estabrook, who is kind of the mentor, and he is one of the points of view, and he keeps quoting the butterfly effect and saying to Harry, one of the protagonists, be the butterfly, because Harry kind of needs to pull himself together and do something. He's in a prolonged grief over the death of his wife.
Okay. Is there, I feel, I don't know. I hope that's not unfair for me to ask you, again, having just acknowledged the accomplishment that this simply represents right here. But I can't help but ask, is there a next book? Obviously, you can't help but write novels, so you'll be writing another, either you are or have been writing another novel or novels. What are your plans or hopes?
There is another book. I'm one of those writers now who doesn't want to get into it too deeply. And I will stay a climate writer. And one of the things I'm really interested in looking at next is marshes and wetlands. And I really am going to have to do a lot of research to learn what's going on there, but I've already found some people I can talk to. And I also know it's going to be about a book about sisters, and that those sisters are probably going to be in their 70s, because there are just not that many books about people in that age group. And I think it's an important and useful age group to focus on.
And since you just brought it up, I want to just finish our conversation very quickly by you letting our audience know about the publishers of
Yes.
this book. And again, you had mentioned that your first book was done by Dutton, I think, and that's one of the big ones. That was a particular kind of experience, which I'm sure was not one in which you felt like you had a lot of agency as the author necessarily, because they're big publishers. These guys are different. Tell us about it.
These guys are different. This is a women-owned, independent publishing house located in California, and they publish exclusively the brilliant works of women over 50. So really, we're all sisters is the way we refer to each other, and there's a lot of bonding that goes on. I have been able to communicate with the publisher, the editor, anybody from the graphics or the social media crew anytime I want to. And right now it's the spring season, so some of my sisters are launching their books, and we have a Zoom. We give each other a round of applause, and off they go. So it's a great publishing model. That's
great. And it resulted in an absolutely lovely cover here, which I think you also didn't do yourself, but had something to do with.
Yeah, so. I did. It was Jenna Blum who was flipping through the internet, and she found this artist, and she said, "That's your cover." I got in touch with him. I said, "Are you interested in this?" He said, "Yes." Put them together with my publisher, and within 24 hours I had my cover.
Oh, that is a lovely story and a lovely way to end. So we congratulate our guest today, Kate Woodworth, for the publication of her second book, not the second book she's written, as we know, but the second book to be published, with more to come, we're sure, in the future. Great to have you match so nicely with your sisters in this new world of publishing for you. We wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
And thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate it.
It was a joy to be here.
Absolutely. And with that, we will end this episode of Talk of the Town. I'm James Milan. We do appreciate Kate being here to share the book and her experience with us. We appreciate you being here as well. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.
ACMi productions are only made possible with your support. Visit patreon.com/ACMi to learn how you can help.